civilization, humankind has left its imprint. Long buried and forgotten, monuments, documents, and legends continue to reveal their secrets, opening many windows to our past. But history is neither concise nor complete. It is a work in progress. Politics, religion, arrogance, jealousy, and fear have influenced many chapters and dismissed discoveries that would provide us with a clearer vision of the past, the present, and even the future. This is the story of a simple farmer and the discovery of an incredible artifact that would destroy his family. An artifact that has affected the lives of all who have been drawn to it. Its mystery has never been revealed until now. The 1800s saw an unprecedented flood of immigration to the United States. From the crowded eastern and southern seaboards, the movement continued inland. The new frontier was rich with resources and provided jobs for those who harvested and mined the materials that would build a great nation. Sleepy settlements grew among the rivers, to the prairies, and to the shores of the Great Lakes, to become thriving cities as the population continued to surge. The railroads had opened up the West and struck an unusual deal with the government. To encourage expansion and control over the new territories, the railroads agreed to transport troops and materials in return for millions of acres of land, which they would market throughout the United States and Europe. The lure of cheap, and in most cases free land, resulted in an overwhelming response from impoverished Europeans. In Sweden, a quiet young man named Olof Oman watched his dreams slip further from his grasp. Born in 1856, Oman was raised on a farm outside the coastal town of Hudiksvall. Farm life left no time for school, and Oman's education was limited to a total of just 36 weeks of intermittent lessons given by a teacher who traveled from town to town. As a young man, Oman earned a meager living and honed some skills as a rough carpenter here in this lumber mill. To him, the United States presented an opportunity to improve his humble status. So in 1879, Olof Oman boarded this crowded ship and made his passage to America.
I landed in Philadelphia and went on the railroad to Pittsburgh, and as it was suggested, further to Columbia, Indianapolis, Peoria, Galva, Bishop's Hill. There, I made a stop for 7 days, and then I continued to Rock Island. Observe that I spoke to these men from the Olof Lind's congregation, and then further to Milwaukee in Wisconsin, a city by Lake Michigan, and then on to St. Paul, Minnesota, then further to Morris, the last station. After having arrived safe and well, I had the honor to say hello to the people of Forsa, Olof Öhman.
During his travels, Oman met and fell in love with Karen Daniels. The two were soon married. Oman and his new bride settled in the pioneer town of Kensington on the eastern edge of the Great Plains in central Minnesota. When they arrived, the area was still largely unsettled, and Olaf had no trouble finding work. In 1891, Oman finally realized his boyhood dream and purchased a parcel of marginal farmland near town. He was proud of his acquisition and determined to make this farm a success. But the Oman family was growing fast, and the farm generated little, if any, profit. Olaf and Karen would eventually rear 9 children, and Olaf took on additional jobs, working tirelessly to meet their needs. On November the 8th, 1898, Oman and his 10-year-old son Edward were clearing a wooded area of his land to make ready for farming. One of the many trees to be removed was a mature poplar tree on the southern slope of a 50-foot knoll. But this tree would not go easy, and seemed to be anchored to the ground by some unseen force. when it was finally uprooted, the secret of its strength was revealed. Clutched firmly in its roots was a 200-pound slab of stone. A stone that would prove to be far from ordinary.
American Petrographic Services, a leading material forensics laboratory, was retained to perform an independent study of the stone. The company is headed by leading forensic geologist, author, and consultant to the Pentagon, Scott Walter.
We identified the rock as a greywacke, probably Precambrian, and so it's a very common rock type that we find in northern Minnesota and into Canada.
In this rare 1949 taped interview, Edward Oman provides further details of the find.
The root established itself over the stone, and one root down into the ground alongside of it, and the other one went over it and down into the ground on the other side. Usually a poplar tree, poplar stump don't grow very deep. That is the roots. And our neighbor Flotton came over as he was grubbing across the section line, or the line between my dad's place and his. He was also quitting. Dad was disgusted about the stumps, hard work, and also stones.
10 people were interviewed within a couple days after the stone's discovery. They looked at the roots, they looked at the stone, they all said the same thing, that the roots were flattened. And this is commonly what happens when a root is in contact with the stone or some other hard object for a prolonged period of time. It was reported to go around the glacial backside of the stone and then down. That's exactly the pattern that we see on the back of the stone. It's consistent with what these people said.
All accounts show the tree was between 30 to 40 years old, placing it over the stone years before the first settlers had arrived. But the stone would contain much more than just the scars of a tree's roots. 10-year-old Edward brushed away some clay soil from the stone and noticed strange inscriptions carved into its surface.
I told Dad we ought to take that home and put it in front of a door. And just then I discovered a carving on it. And I told Dad that it's written on it. And he examined it. He started to look at it too, and he figured it was Indians that has carved that rock.
Olaf Oman took the stone to his barn, where he hosed it down and removed caked mud from many of the inscriptions.
He took a nail and cleaned out the characters. There probably was mud and dirt packed into the inscription.
Oman was astonished to find the entire face and edge of the stone were covered with these strange markings.
You were there when the stone was dug up, weren't you?
Yes, sir.
You saw these markings of the stone right after it was dug up?
Yes, sir.
You saw it before your father did, yeah?
Yes, sir.
Olaf Oman could not have imagined how much his life was about to change, for he and his family were about to be hurled into the center of a raging controversy that would continue for more than a century. News of the discovery spread quickly, and the stone was put on display in the window of the Kensington Bank and Real Estate Office. The stone sat in the window for nearly 2 months, yet in a small town of Swedish, German, and Norwegian immigrants, no one recognized the inscription. Most speculated the symbols were Indian, others believed it was Greek or even Egyptian. Finally, local businessman J.P. Hedberg took action.
The stone was brought into my office in Kensington by the finder, Olaf Oman. I took quite much interest in the same. I copied the same and sent the copy to Swan J. Turnblad, J.P. Hedberg, March 1910.
Hedberg's handwritten copy would prove to lack much detail, and many symbols were omitted. Svan Turnblad was the editor of the Minneapolis newspaper published in the Swedish language. He did not know what to make of the symbols copied by Hedberg, and in January of 1899, Turnblad sent the copy to the Greek department of the University of Minnesota. It was there someone noticed that the symbols were actually Norse runes. The copy was forwarded to Olaus J. Breda, professor of Scandinavian languages at the university. The word rune comes from a root word which means mystery or secret. There are many theories regarding the origin of runes. In Scandinavian mythology, the god Odin hung for 9 days and 9 nights upon the tree of woe in order to learn the mystery of the runes. Runes were secret alphabets that could be unlocked or read. Professor Heinrich Williams of the University of Uppsala in Sweden is considered by many to be the world's foremost authority on Scandinavian languages.
Most people have thought that the runes are derived from Latin letters, because if you look at the oldest runes, you can see a very close relationship between runes and classical writing. And I believe you can actually derive every single rune from a Latin letter. But there have been other candidates too. The Greek alphabet could be one such, and the Etruscan script that was later used by Celtic tribes in the Alps.
Breda was able to translate some of the hand-rendered copy, but soon ran into problems.
I was unable to decipher the numerals because I was unfamiliar with the runic primstav calendars. Olaus Breda, 1899.
But primstav calendars were widely used by Catholic clergy and Scandinavian lawmakers in the 13th and 14th centuries. Breda's translation appeared in Turnblad's newspaper and in the Minneapolis Journal.
The runes exhibited certain suspicious peculiarities, but not being an expert in that field, I could not build much on that observation. For these reasons, I pronounced the inscription a modern forgery and declined to have anything further to do with the matter. Olaus Breda, February 22nd, 1899.
It is important to note that Breda himself stated he was not an expert, based his opinion solely on a rough, handwritten copy provided by a third-party layman, yet without question. The university accepted his recommendation.
Do not procure the stone for further study. Olaus Breda, 1899.
Chemist Barry Hansen is part of the independent team of scientists commissioned by the Runestone Museum to study the stone.
And we see a lot of cases where the experts more or less wanted this controversy to go away. They actually, some of them tried to suppress the existence of the stone. The first person to look at it was Olaus Breda, in fact, at the University of Minnesota. He never saw the Kensington stone. He recommended that the university not study the Kensington stone, but yet he called it a forgery. And for 100 years, people referred to Olaus Breda as the first expert to disprove that the Kensington runestone was authentic.
In March of 1899, the stone was sent to Northwestern University, where it was examined by George Kerm, professor of Old German. Kerm and his associate, John Stewart, studied the stone for several weeks.
To me, there is no doubt that Olaf Oman found the stone under the roots of a tree 40 or 50 years old. I do not know anything more about the stone. He sent it to me, I kept it a long while, for a month or even longer. I worked on it daily. It was easy for me to read the inscription, but it was much more difficult for me to come to the conclusion as to the genuineness of this inscription. I am not an expert Scandinavian scholar, and my opinion would not be final.
But Kerm goes on to state that a rune called the J rune proves the stone to be fake. Dr. Richard Nielsen has studied the Kensington runestone for more than 13 years. His research has led to groundbreaking discoveries that have dramatically advanced the field of medieval Scandinavian linguistics.
They said that the rune did not exist in Scandinavia, that it was invented by the farmer. However, I found it in the Codex Runicus, which is a book. Codex is for a book in Latin. The Codex Runicus had over 100 pages of the Scantia law, the most famous law in Scandinavia, written in runes. And in this book, this runic book, from around 1320, you find this rune, which had been stated by the experts as to be a sure proof of forgery. So this was rather startling to me.
Kerm also states that the double dots or umlauts over a few of the runes are absolute proof that the stone is fake.
The umlauts were modern, I answer. That would be absolutely decisive in and of itself. Professor George Kerm, 1899.
Again, Kerm's opinion would prove to be entirely untrue.
They said umlauts didn't come about until the 16th century, till the invention, certainly till the invention of the printing press. Since they're umlauts, the Kensington stone must be a fraud. Well, what happens is when you go back to the source documents and the actual manuscripts of the 14th century, you find that these double dots occur for other reasons. It turns out that they possibly are diphthongs, and they possibly are for a medieval abbreviation convention for inserting a vowel, for example, and they're not intended to be umlauts at all.
During the study, Kerm's associate John Stewart, a trained geologist, took the first known photographs of the stone and made the first documented hard scientific observation of the relic.
The carved features of the stone show as much age as the weathered surface, indicating the carved surface and its inscription are equally weathered. John Stewart, 1899.
A lot of people thought we needed to take a sample off of the inscription or one of the characters. We don't have to do that because this entire split side was made at the time of the carving. So these surfaces, anywhere on this surface, is the same as looking at a ruined form, a flaked area, or the O-shoot area. It makes no difference. The weathering should be the same. So I took a chip sample off of the split side of the stone. The surface of this chip sample should represent the weathering characteristics that are the same as those other areas I told you on the stone, the same as the inscription. The key mineral that I wanted to look at was the micas, the muscovite, biotite, and the chlorite. These minerals break down relatively slowly. The micas, when you look at them, are pristine and fresh on the fresh fractured surface, which would be the same as when these surfaces were made. The glacial surface would represent the surface after 10,000 years of weathering. When we looked at those surfaces, the micas had completely decomposed. Not surprised. We expected that. Now, the key thing that I wanted to look at is what does the surface look like that was made the day the stone was carved? If it was a modern forgery, I would expect to see the micas to look a lot like this. If not, I should see at least some degree of weathering, perhaps a lot of weathering, because we're talking about over 500 years of weathering on this surface. I was actually quite shocked when the images came up under the SEM. The micas were gone.
John Stewart's observations were correct, but his findings would be completely ignored for more than a century, while Kerm, like Breda before him, would go on to be regarded as an expert by generations of scholars. The stone was returned to Oman, and Kerm's opinion made the headlines. This brought unwanted attention to the humble farmer and his family, who now viewed the stone as a source of embarrassment. During this time, a young University of Wisconsin historian, Hjalmar Holland, was traveling the country gathering information for a book he was writing on Norwegian immigration. In August of 1907, he paid Oman a visit to see the stone firsthand. What he saw made him even more curious. Many believe that Holland purchased the stone from Oman for amounts that range from $5 upward to $500.
Edward, do you know of your own knowledge whether your father ever got any money for that stone?
No, he did not.
No money whatsoever?
No money whatsoever. Yeah. The only thing that he got was the first book he wrote of the Norwegian historic settlement of Minnesota.
That is, that who wrote? Holland?
Holland.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Holland took the stone back to his home in Wisconsin to study it further. After 2 years of intense research, he became convinced the stone was a genuine medieval artifact. Holland's translation of the runes would be far more accurate than any of his predecessors. 8 Goths and 22 Norwegian on a journey of exploration from Vinland, very far west. We had camp by 2 rocky islands, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were out fishing one day. After we came home, we found 10 men, red with blood and dead. Ave Maria, save us from evil. Holland then translated the runes along the edge of the stone. Have 10 men by the sea to look after our ships. 14 days' journey from this island. Year 1362. If authentic, the Kensington runestone would bear the longest runic inscription ever discovered, and prove that Europeans had explored and occupied North America long before Columbus or Cabot had made their claims. It would also evidence the far-reaching influence of the Vatican, for it would contain the oldest Christian prayer ever found on the entire continent. Holland began traveling the country giving lectures and seeking the aid of the academic establishment to help validate his findings. His persistence finally paid off, and in 1909 the Minnesota State Historical Society organized a committee to examine the stone. The committee designated eminent state geologist Professor Newton Winchell to head the investigation.
He studied the stone, and his opinion was that the weathering was absolutely consistent with it being a legitimate artifact. The weathering was very old, and his conclusion was that it was authentic.
Winchell and his team examined the stone in his lab and made several trips to Kensington to investigate the site of the find. Winchell and the investigators interviewed the Oman family, their neighbors, and many townsfolk. They collected signed affidavits regarding Oman's character and details of the discovery. During one of these visits, the investigators noticed that Oman possessed a Swedish grammar book, published in 1840, which contained rune forms. The book was signed by its previous owner, Sven Fogelblad, a deceased Lutheran minister. The investigators believed that they had cracked the case.
The runologists and linguists who have claimed that the Kensington runestone is a modern artifact have tried to explain that Oman, who was accused of carving the stone, had a book which told him everything he needed to know to carve the Kensington runestone. This book was Rosander.
The committee sent the book to the United College Seminary, a Lutheran college, where it was examined by a team that included graduate student John A. Holvik. Holvik finds the book contains just 12 of 23 runes, and only 4 of the 46 words that appear on the stone. Holvik reports his findings.
The difference in the rune systems and the so-called errors in the inscription, with some parallel correct forms in the book, make it evident that there is no connection between the inscription on the Kensington runestone and the book bearing the name Sven Fogelblad. John A. Holvik.
Meanwhile, Professor Winchell's findings would send shockwaves throughout the scientific community.
I am convinced from the geological conditions and the physical changes that the region has experienced, probably within the last 500 years, that the said stone is not a modern forgery and must be accepted as a genuine record of an exploration in Minnesota at the date stated in the inscription. Professor Newton Winchell, December 13, 1909.
The majority of the members of the Historical Society were satisfied with the results and concluded that the runestone was authentic. But reputations were now at stake, and influential members of the academic establishment who had built their careers on the likes of Breda and Kerm took an aggressive stance to defend their positions at all costs. Feeling the pressure, the Historical Society trod lightly and published their conclusion.
Resolved that this committee renders a favorable opinion of the Kensington runestone, provided that the references to Scandinavian literature given in this committee's written report and accompanying papers be verified by a competent specialist in the Scandinavian languages to be selected by this committee, and that he approves the conclusions of this report. University of Minnesota, July 1910.
Science would take a back seat to the excitement of more emotionally charged debate. Scholars with little knowledge of medieval languages and no regard for hard physical evidence proved to be more colorful characters to news-hungry report. If we are to approach the subject of the Kensington runestone in a truly objective manner, we need to examine all of its attributes, beginning with the history of those who are believed to have carved it. Norsemen were those who lived in the northern regions of Europe, comprising the modern countries of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and parts of Germany. The term Viking actually refers to those Norse who went exploring or adventuring. The Vikings possessed superior nautical technology. Their ships and navigational skills at sea and through inland waterways were unsurpassed.
The Viking boat was a marvel of engineering for its day. Somebody really got the design criteria down, and it was a simple criteria, and this is it, that the boat had to be beached by its crew. Now, because it had to be beached by its crew, whether it was 20 men or 40 men, you have to build a lightweight boat. And that's what created the Viking vessel.
Many ships varying in size and purpose have been found throughout Europe. But none can compare to the Gogstad. Housed at the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, Norway, it is by far the most complete, authentic Viking vessel ever unearthed. Viking colonies formed along the protected harbours and islands of the Baltic Sea to the steep fjords that fed the Atlantic Ocean. These settlements formed a network that allowed the Vikings to extend their trade routes and influence throughout many countries. The Viking society was rich with culture. They were excellent craftsmen. Iron workers who made armor, weapons, tools, and steels for starting fires. But it is not this rich culture that conjures up images of the Vikings. Instead, they would be remembered as brutal, barbaric warmongers and fearless pirates. This reputation was well earned. The Vikings spread fear throughout the entire known world, stealing treasure, conquering territories, and taking slaves. Expansion soon became necessary for their survival. While monasteries and churches were easy targets, the treasures of silver and gold may not have been the only attraction to the Viking raiders. The orders that occupied these monasteries were generally educated men from wealthy families, guardians of knowledge who had made perilous journeys to unknown lands. As early as the 5th century, Irish monks had already reached the Hebrides, Orkneys, and Faroe Islands. Records found in the secret Vatican archives tell of a monk, Brendan, who was canonized a saint. Brendan was born in Ireland about 489 AD and founded the monastery at Clonfert, Galway. He and 17 other monks sailed westward in a curragh, a wood-framed boat covered in sewn oxhide. During his travels, Brendan recounts seeing a giant column rising out of the sea.
This column was covered with a most unusual canopy, so strange indeed that the coracle could pass through the openings. It was the colour of silver and seemed harder than marble.
Brendan and his crew eventually reached a place he named Land of Promise of the Saints. 7 years later, the monks would return to Ireland with strange fruit and precious stone. But where was this land the monks had spent the past 7 years? During the 1960s, scholars from Trent University mapped and dated 900 etchings, or petroglyphs, on a large marble slab near Peterborough, Canada. Most of the glyphs had been created by the native Algonquins, sometime around 1300. But some of the glyphs appeared to be more ancient in origin. These glyphs depict ships with masts, side rudder, and 10 to 20 oars. They are almost identical to glyphs found in Sweden, depicting curraghs, not unlike the ones said to be used by St. Brendan. In 1974, Professor Barry Fell of Harvard University examined the glyphs and was astonished when he recognized the dots beside the glyphs as tiffinar, a form of script used during the Bronze Age. Fell translated the script: Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor, ships fighting, and Fenris, a wolf-like being found in Norse mythology. Fell was convinced that Bronze Age Scandinavians had created those glyphs and could be of great historical significance, and increases the probability that Vikings had learned about distant lands to the west from Irish monks. As the Viking expansion continued, they became more and more dependent upon diplomacy and peaceful trade relations. Viking colonies were developing into bustling trade centers, and Bergen, Norway had become the center of the Viking civilization and the gateway to exploration of the North Atlantic. The Norse sagas suggest that Irish monks were already in Iceland when the Norse arrived in 860. By 930, Iceland was settled, but it would soon experience growing pains. Overpopulation resulted in a major famine in 975, and conditions would continue to worsen. In 982, Eric Thorwaldson, better known as Eric the Red, was banished from Iceland for a period of 3 years for killing a man. During his exile, he sailed west in search of a land that had been spotted by a sailor who had been blown off course. Eric reached the shores of a place he called Greenland and explored its many fjords. He returned to Iceland in 985 and told his story to an audience of desperate citizens. Needless to say, he had no trouble organizing a major colonizing expedition, and in a short time 25 ships carrying hundreds of people, livestock and supplies set sail. Some turned back, while others were lost in stormy seas or crushed by ice drifters. Only 14 of those ships would reach the shores of Greenland. But other ships would follow, and soon more than 300 farmsteads were established around 2 settlements in southwestern Greenland. The eastern settlement became the most heavily populated region, with 3,000 to 4,500 inhabitants by the year 1100. More than 1,000 years later, the land they cleared is still in use. The western settlement was about 300 miles further north, and grew to a population of about 1,500. During this time, the Inuit had arrived from Canada and began migrating southwards. The Norsemen quickly realized that the Inuit held the key to their very survival. The Inuit had well-established trade routes and hunting skills that would help the Norse build Greenland into a major center of European trade. But politics, climate, and religion soon contribute to the decline and fall not only of the Viking era, but the entire Norse population of Greenland. The religion of the Vikings was one of the last pagan religions to exist in Europe. It was King Haakon, foster son of England's King Athelstan, that first tried to establish the Christian religion in Norway. But his subjects rebelled and he gave up the cause. Haakon's successor was Olaf Turgevson, who during an attack on the city of London was captured, presented with an offer he couldn't refuse: convert or die. Olaf was baptized in 994 AD and given 16,000 pounds of silver. In return, he agreed to cease his raids. By 998 AD, all of Norway had converted to Catholicism. Ina Uljan, archaeologist for the Historiska Museet in Stockholm, explains.
We believe that Christianity came to Sweden with the Vikings, and that is the first sign of Christianity is not from the west, it is from the east. And that is because of the Swedish Vikings. They went eastwards for trading and maybe for some raiding as well. And this is a difference from the Norwegian ones and from the Danish ones, because they went west. But basically the Swedish Vikings went east, and they went down all the way to Byzance, to Constantinople, that is. And also some of them came to Greece. And there they picked up the ideas, and they picked up the ideas about the Eastern Christianity.
This runestone, dating to 998, depicts an early Christian marriage. In the year 1000, Icelandic Parliament ruled that Icelanders should be in the Catholic faith. At about this time, Eric's son Leif left Greenland for Norway to serve the king and became a believer of this new Christian faith. Leif Erikson brought his new faith back home, and his mother built the first church in Greenland. The Roman Catholic Church quickly became major landowners, and construction of 2 monasteries commenced immediately. A cathedral was constructed, and hundreds of churches sprang up throughout the country. Many farms even had their own small church. Greenland's population had risen quickly, and new construction had stripped the forests. The Greenlanders began importing their lumber from Markland. But lumber was to be the least of their worries. When the Norse had arrived in Greenland, the climate was at the peak of a warm phase. But by 1200 AD, a period known as the Little Ice Age had begun. The ocean temperature fell, and the Arctic warm front retreated. Ice floes covered the sheltered inlets and fjords, isolating farms, killing off the fishing industry, and prohibiting trade with the mainland. As the climate grew colder, crops died in the frost. By 1261, the Greenlanders had grown desperate and gave up their independence. They became subjects of Norway under the agreement that 2 trading vessels should be sent each year. But the German Hanseatic League had come to control all of Northern Europe's ocean-going trade and saw little value in Greenland. Without the League's protection, Norway could not honor its agreement. The colonies of Greenland began a rapid decline. By 1340, the Greenlanders were dealt a final demoralizing blow. The church had become extremely corrupt and seized nearly all of the citizens' personal property. Greenlanders were reduced to serfs or tenants on their own land. By 1342, the entire population of the eastern settlement had mysteriously vanished, leaving their farms and settlements intact. 1 year later, 17 Greenlanders arrived in Bergen, Norway, with news that the western settlement had also been abandoned, and the few that remained had fallen away from the church. King Magnus, who had just 2 years earlier donated a large amount of money to the Greenland Cathedral, was outraged, but he would take no action until 1350. He had more serious issues at hand. More than 1/3 of Magnus's subjects had already fallen to the Black Plague that had swept through Europe, and he was struggling to rebuild his kingdom. How could a 350-year-old community of more than 3,500 people vanish so without any trace? There is no evidence of a war with the Inuit, nor of mass extinction. No records, no grave sites, no remains. Where, then, did they go? Heimer Holland was convinced that he had found the answer in a possible link that led from a royal decree by King Magnus directly to the Vatican, evidence he believed would expose the actual identity of 2 members of the exploration party described on the Kensington runestone. On October the 28th, 1354, Magnus Eriksson, King of Norway, Sweden and Skåne, issued orders to Paul Knudsen to find the missing fugitives of Greenland. Paul Knudsen, Swedish judge and member of the Royal Council, chose an elite group from the King's Honor Guard, enlisted the services of Nicholas, a Franciscan friar and famous astronomer from Oxford, to serve as his navigator. It is believed that upon reaching Greenland, the party continued on to a place called Vinland. Surviving members of the expedition returned to England and Norway in 1363 or 64. Nicholas presented the kings of England and Norway with a written account of the voyage, entitled Inventio Fortunata.
If we talk about a couple of these 16th century maps, they refer to a book called the Inventio Fortunatae. The Inventio Fortunatae, according to the best knowledge we have, was written in 1364. And that's 2 years after the date on the Kensington runestone. Columbus referred to the Inventio Fortunatae as one of the books that he had used when preparing for his voyage.
The earliest description of Vinland is found in the Tale of the Greenlanders from the saga of Olaf Turgelson. The sagas tell of a merchant named Arni who was blown off course while sailing from Iceland to Greenland in 986 AD. He reached the shore of a heavily forested land and headed north. A week later, he found his way back to Greenland. 10 years later, Leif Erikson retraced his route and sailed along the shores of a land of rock and ice he called Helluland, and continued past a densely forested flatland he named Markland. Leif finally reached a place of temperate climate, with fields of wheat and rivers filled with salmon. He named this place Vinland. Leif and his crew stayed the winter and returned to Greenland in the spring. Soon the Greenlanders began importing their lumber from Markland, and many other expeditions to Vinland were organized. One expedition carried 135 men, 20 women, livestock, and other goods. Another led to the death of Leif's brother, Torvald, who was killed in a skirmish with local natives referred to as Skraelings. The Kensington runestone states the party had travelled west from Vinland. But where was Vinland? Helgi Ingstad, a lawyer-turned-explorer, and his wife, Anne Stein, an ambitious archaeologist, spent years in their quest to uncover the lost Viking settlements of Vinland. In 1960, they would make a discovery that embarrassed and silenced many prominent scholars who had denied the very existence of Vinland. In Newfoundland, at Lance aux Meadows, Ingstad investigated some mounds in an overgrown field that were suspected to be the ruins of a Viking village. Excavation revealed that they were actually the walls of 8 buildings, identical to those found in Iceland and Greenland from the 11th century. Artifacts found at the site show that women also inhabited the settlement. Further excavation revealed an abundance of slag from the smelting and working of iron. A large number of iron boat nails, or rivets, were also uncovered. This groundbreaking discovery is definite proof that the Norse had occupied North America as early as 1000 AD. But was this? All of the sagas described Vinland as a place of lush vegetation, self-sown grain and oats, which would suggest that Vinland was located further south or even inland of this settlement. The fact that Lance aux Meadows never housed any more than 100 people, along with evidence of busy ironworks and a large amount of boat nails, might indicate it was a base camp, way station of sorts.
If you look at maps of the northern coast of Canada from the 16th century, and even moving back as far as 1507, you will find Hudson Bay is located on these maps. Now, Henry Hudson did not explore Hudson Bay until 1611, 1612. And yet we see the bay showing up long before, over 100 years before the first known European explorer went into this area.
What other artifacts and discoveries might offer proof that Europeans had occupied North America long before Columbus ever set sail? We know that Leif Erikson arrived in Vinland in the year 1000, and the Norse sagas document other expeditions that would follow. Solving the mystery of Vinland could provide a much better understanding of who may have actually carved the Kensington runestone.
Well, I think everybody is hoping to find further evidence beyond the Lance aux Meadows discovery of the presence of Scandinavians in North America.
In 1965, researchers at Yale University made a discovery that would send shockwaves throughout the entire academic world. An 11 by 16-inch map was found, tucked inside a book of medieval manuscripts that had been donated to Yale's Beneke Library. The map contains a drawing of an island in the upper left-hand corner, which is labeled Vinlandia Insula, or Island of Vinland, and depicts the northeastern coast of America. The translated text above the island describes a visit to Vinland by Bishop Erik Knudsen in 1117 AD. A more complete scientific analysis was conducted in 1985 when Yale secretly lent the map to University of California, Davis for testing. It was discovered the ink was identical to more than 150 medieval manuscripts already analyzed by the university, and recent carbon dating showed the parchment was compatible with the date scholars believe the map to have been made. If authentic, the Vinland map is the only map of North America to be found to be drawn before the arrival of Columbus. But does Vinland refer to a specific settlement or a series of settlements connecting a much larger geographical area? No Man's Land Island off Cape Cod may provide further clues. Curiously, the early pilgrims had originally named the island Norman's Island, after the Viking conquerors of Normandy. The island has been off-limits to the public for many years. It has been used by the United States military for aerial bombing exercises. Unexploded bombs litter the island and present a constant danger. The island even contains freshwater lakes, and ancient petroglyphs created by long-vanished Native Americans adorn its many rock formations. But the island also holds an even more curious treasure from our past. The No Man's Land Island runestone was known to early colonists and first photographed in 1925 by the island's caretaker.
Locate the stone, clean off some of the seaweed and barnacles, and actually find some of the grooves, the rune grooves, which we presume represent the inscription.
The stone reads, Leif Erikson, 1080. As with the Kensington stone, early scholars were quick to dismiss the No Man's Land Island stone. But no argument against the stone's authenticity has been proven to be valid. Incredibly, these symbols may lead directly to an ancient Viking settlement located near Schleswig-Holstein in Germany. Is the Heithbu Viking Ship Museum, home of the famous Hedeby runestone.
The Hedeby stone was found about 100 years ago, buried in the field, and it's pretty well preserved. And this is an extremely interesting stone because it's the first stone that has a dotted I standing for the letter E, or the sound E. And it also has the earliest spelling of Erik, it's E-R-I-K. In fact, the dotted E is used in that name. There's also a number of interesting runes on this inscription. There seems to be some similarity to this Hedeby runic row to that is found at No Man's Land Island.
In fact, there are 4 Hedeby stones, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And 2 and 4 are from a much earlier period than 1 and 3. Hedeby 2 and 4 are probably from the 920s or 930s. But the one Dick's talking about is from a later period, probably from the 980s. Linguistic significance of the Hedeby 1 and 3 stones is, as Dick says, that they contain the first datable examples of dotted runes. So if they are from the 980s, as people have supposed, then we can date our first dotted runes to that period.
This has a big bearing on the No Man's Land Island inscription because there's a dotted I on it, and the initial claim was that was too early for the supposed date on the stone, which is an M and an I rune.
The link between the Hedeby stone and the No Man's Land Island runestone could be a vital clue to the place where Leif Erikson and his men had spent the winter, the place referred to on the Kensington runestone as Vinland.
Other runic inscriptions are being carefully investigated in the United States from the east coast of New England. One of these is the Bourne stone that is found near the Cape Cod Canal in Massachusetts. The stone was discovered during Pilgrim times, so its provenance is not in question. It was turned over to the Indians for a Christian church, and they apparently used it for a stepping stone face down.
Bourne stone has definitely signs of heavy weathering, let's say.
The Bourne stone has been to Scott Walter's lab in St. Paul, where it has been investigated with a careful photographic record, microscopic record of the marks on the stone.
On the shores of the Atlantic is the small town of Heavener, Oklahoma. Heavener was founded in 1894. A few miles outside this sleepy town is Poteau Mountain, home to perhaps the most unusual discovery of all. Standing 12 feet high, 10 feet wide and 16 inches thick, this giant stone slab bears inscriptions that may be much older than those found along the eastern side.
I was immediately struck by the fact that the runes on this inscription, the Heavener runestone, was definitely from the older Fufark, and it indicated that it was from a period of around 700. This was startling because the concept of Scandinavians being here this early was a bit hard to grasp.
The problem is that in Europe, you know it, any inscription which is found here is doubted.
Maniacs, if you even give them any attention when they come and say, could this be a runestone? But I think that is a very legitimate question. You find something with letters and you don't know what it is, and you go to the experts, and what you want to meet is not the attitude of, you're a fool for even asking.
The next few lines on the face of the Kensington runestone describe the location of the carver's base camp. We had camp by 2 rocky skerries, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were and fished 1 day. Holland believed that camp was located along the north shore of Lake Cormorant in Douglas County, Minnesota. The next line on the face of the Kensington runestone reads, "After we came home, found 10 men red with blood and dead." Holland believed that the Kensington party were victims of an attack by hostile natives. The final line on the face of the runestone reads, "Ave Maria, save us from evil." At a time in America when various religions were competing for dominance, this particular line might have fueled a certain amount of prejudice among its critics. Not because this stone contained the first Christian prayer ever discovered on the entire continent, but because it is a Catholic prayer. The runes along the edge of the stone read, "Have 10 men by the sea to look after our ships. 14 days' journey from this island. Year 1362. Holland believed that the sea described on the stone was the Hudson Bay, and that the hill where the stone was found was once surrounded by water, making it an island. Holland theorized that the party had traveled from the Hudson Bay up the Nelson River to the Red River and then took the Buffalo River to arrive in the vicinity. That route could easily have been covered in 14 days. The late Thomas Ryersgord, a Minneapolis attorney and author, studied the Kensington runestone for years and had his own theories. Ryersgord believed the Kensington party were not killed in a skirmish, but succumbed to the plague which they had carried with them. He believed the party landed somewhere on the western shore of Lake Superior, and that the stone was carved just south of that area, then carried by Indians and buried face down at the place where it was found. Geological evidence may support his theory.
Exactly where is the bedrock source that this stone came from? We think it might be the Thompson Formation.
Many routes were traveled by generations of fur trappers and missionaries. Yet critics still argue that any proposed route the Kensington party could have taken is beyond belief.
Many people in Europe have stated that why would a stone been carved by the Scandinavians in 1362 in such a wilderness? This, of course, shows a misunderstanding about North America. First of all, the Kensington location is within 10 to 15 miles of 3 principal watersheds. It's the only place like that in the United States. The watershed of Hudson Bay through the Red River Valley, the rivers to Lake Superior and on to the Atlantic, and within a few miles from the Minnesota River, going to the Mississippi River, down to the Gulf of Mexico. So it was an ideal trade location. It was, if anyone traveled into the interior of North America, they would have ultimately probably passed that spot.
Hjalmar Holland continued to rally support for further study of the stone. Instead of answering this challenge, they diverted the attention to the farmer, Olaf Oman. Oman's character and details of the find were questioned publicly in newspapers throughout the country. To a poor, uneducated immigrant farmer struggling to support his wife and 9 children, this must have been devastating. Ironically, one of his loudest critics was none other than John Holvik, who had participated in the Minnesota Historical Society's investigation in 1910. Holvik's research had provided evidence that Oman could not have possibly carved the stone. Holvik had since joined the faculty of Concordia College, a major Lutheran university and seminary in Moorhead, Minnesota. It was not until the mid-1920s that he approached the subject of the Kensington stone. This was an important period for the Norwegian Americans and was highlighted by the Norwegian American Centennial. Scandinavian pride was honored by ongoing festivities throughout the United States. Whatsoever, Holvik cast himself into the spotlight of debate, declaring the Kensington runestone was a 19th century fake. Other geological studies were conducted in 1929, which also determined that the inscriptions could in no way be modern, but Holvik remained staunch in the face of overwhelming evidence. The stone garnered little further public interest until 1932, when Holland's book, The Kensington Stone, was published. For more than 37 years, Olaf Oman had sworn that he knew nothing of its creation.
I now send you a few written words to let you know that Papa is dead. He died August 27th in the morning. We led him to bed on Saturday evening. He felt so bad and his legs hurt. He then laid down until Tuesday. That day we got him up in a chair, but when we laid him back in bed, he took 3 short breaths and it was over. Karen Oman, 2nd September 1935.
Archaeologists ever that studied the stone even conceived that it was less than 50 years prior to the finding of the stone, that the stone was buried.
But Holvik and other critics again chose to completely ignore the hard evidence. The deceased farmer and his family were easy prey, and Holvik launched a barrage of attacks in newspaper articles, branding Olaf Oman as a liar, forger, and a thief. In response to any rebuttal, Holvik remained in pompous denial.
It is a labor lost for any of us here in this country to say anything on matters of the runes or the language of the Kensington rune stone.
Until a 1948 study by the renowned Smithsonian Institution would again wake a sleeping giant, rock the foundation of the academic establishment.
The Kensington rune stone is probably the most important archaeological object yet found in North America.
This outraged many scholars who had dismissed the stone as a fake. Unable to refute the physical hard evidence, they shifted their argument to focus solely upon the linguistics of the stone. Sloppy research and lack of reference materials made it impossible to support their opinions.
What characterizes the Kensington runestone through the years is the fact that all of these people had such definitive opinions. And when you look closely at where their opinions came from, you realize, when you look at their actual quotations, you realize that their opinions were not based upon scholarship.
Holvik became desperate to maintain his credibility and launched his own investigation, not of the stone, but of the Oman family and the townfolk of Kensington. He convinced his son to travel to Kensington to conduct interviews under the guise of an impartial study. But the interviews only reaffirmed the honesty and integrity of Olaf Oman. Holvik's next move would reveal much about his motives and expose his true character. Olaf Oman's daughter Amanda had lived in the shadow of the stone. She had felt the stares, heard the gossip, endured the pesky reporters, and suffered the ridicule, an awkward status for a young girl growing up in a small conservative farm town. Amanda married and moved far away from Kensington and its memories. But her marriage would prove to be only a temporary refuge from the stigma. She returned to Kensington a widow at 54 and moved into her childhood home. Holvik saw an opportunity. He gained Amanda's trust and convinced her that he would help to clear her family's name. She was more than eager to cooperate, and Holvik paid her a visit. At the Oman home, Holvik noticed a scrapbook that her father had compiled in his later years. He asked if he might borrow it, and Amanda agreed. 3 months later, she received a letter from Holvik requesting to purchase the book, enclosed with a check for $5. But Holvik had breached her trust.
Dear sir, I'm returning check as we don't want to sell this book. We really want to keep it, so please return it at once. Did look over books here, but I'm sure there is none that Mr. Holvik would care for. Return schoolmaster, and we value it as a keepsake. Yours truly, Manda Oman, October 16, 1949.
But Holvik did not answer her request. He was desperate to find something, anything, to prove that Oman had carved the stone. Inside the scrapbook, Holvik had noticed a picture of the god Buddha, which contained the word Aum, a meditative Buddhist prayer. His maniacal obsession would soon be revealed to all by what is probably the most ridiculous claim any critic of the stone has ever made. Holvik insisted that the V in Ave Maria inscribed on the runestone was actually a U, and that Oman had copied the word from this picture. He used this to unleash yet another malicious attack on the deceased Olaf Oman and his family. Amanda became extremely distraught. She blamed herself for Holvik's betrayal and for her family's name being smeared in the newspapers. After a lifetime of heartache, her world finally came crashing down. And on a rainy April morning, Amanda Oman took her own life, a victim of the Kensington Enigma. Holvik had lost his credibility among all but the most die-hard critics, and continued to ignore and undermine serious scientific investigations, arguing the language of the runic script was modern, and even claiming that some of the symbols were invented by the farmer.
The greatest authority of his time, Eric Moltke, in the 1950s, and he said that the stone has to be a forgery because here you can see we have the long branch N, and that went out of use in 1100. And so that shows that the Kensington stone is a forgery. Well, it's been shown now that the rune didn't go out of use in 1100, and it's been used on the island of Gotland well into the 1300s. Now, interestingly enough, that information was presented to Eric Moltke before he died, and after it was presented to him, he dropped it from his argument. He never admitted he was wrong, but he dropped it from his argument. So the interesting thing is that some people have read his earlier work, and so they claim that that's a reason why the stone is a forgery, when in fact Eric Moltke himself dropped it from his arguments, but yet we still have experts claiming that the Kensington stone is a forgery based upon information that's been outdated for about 50 years now.
Hjalmar Holland had spent his lifetime trying to unravel the mystery of the stone, and in 1960 away peacefully in his northern Wisconsin home. With Holland gone, there was no voice strong enough to challenge the opinion of the establishment, and a new generation of so-called experts would rise against the stone.
We have many people who qualified as experts because they were in positions of authority and in their positions of stature and status who simply didn't do their homework. One of these people wrote a full-length book, and he was the director of the graduate school at the University of Minnesota, and I'll guarantee you he didn't do his homework.
That man was Theodore Blegen. Like Holvik, Blegen was intent on showing the public that he would be the one to prove the stone was a fake. In August of 1967, Blegen orchestrated the production known as the Grand Tapes. Blegen promoted the Grand Tapes as being the deathbed confession of John Graham to his son Walter, that he and Oman had carved the stone. But the Grand Tapes would prove to be entirely bogus, for they contain no confession whatsoever. Even more arcane is the fact that John Graham didn't even see his deathbed until 9 years after the alleged conversation with his son.
And there have been people who are violently against the possible authenticity of this stone who have treated, for example, the discoverer of the stone in a completely unacceptable manner. They have, as I see it, accused him of fabricating the stone without any kind of good evidence of this, and in that case I don't think you should.
Their work should be viewed askance. Their work has to be viewed with great dubiousness.
It's part of the expose, I guess, of 36 people who are all considered to be language or experts or runologists or linguistic experts who rendered their opinion. They rendered a very definitive opinion on a Kensington stone, and it's now very clear that they pretended to have knowledge which they didn't have.
It's taken more than a century for the mystery of the Kensington runestone to emerge from a tightly woven web of rumor, speculation, and deceit. The tireless efforts of Richard Nielsen, Henrik Williams, Scott Walter, Michael Barnes, and Barry Hansen have spawned groundbreaking new discoveries. These startling revelations have attracted the attention of the global scientific community and captured the imagination of the public. Their work was the focus of a series of articles by V magazine journalist Lars Weston, which resulted in an international symposium. The Kensington runestone travelled to Stockholm, Sweden for the event. Top scientists and scholars from around the world converged on the Historica Museet to share and gather information on the stone.
The U.S. Ambassador to Sweden, Mr. Charles Engel, please come forward.
As America's ambassador to Sweden, I want to thank both Sweden's Museum of Historical Antiquities and the Kensington Runestone Museum for reminding us of our close and enduring ties by organizing this exhibit. I hope that you gathered here tonight will enjoy it. I guess I should say the exhibition is formally open. Thank you very much.
From Stockholm, the stone was then transported to Hudiksvall, in the region of Forsa, where Olof Åman had spent his youth. There another symposium was held, this one attended by generations of the Åman family from around the world.
Or not support a party going all the way over here. First of all, people saying to me,
oh, I'm here. This is me, Anna, and my mother is Kerstin, and her father was Gottfried. And my grandfather's father was Daniel, and he was brother to Olof Åman.
Overwhelming geological evidence proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the farmer Olof Åman did not carve the stone. Yet for more than 100 years, highly influential members of the academic establishment have perpetrated that myth and brought shame to an innocent man and generations of his family. This unethical behavior reveals a much darker side of those entrusted to provide our knowledge of history, science, and the arts. Biased, unprovable opinions should never replace the facts. For whether the Kensington runestone is authentic or not, only through serious objective studies and extensive ongoing research will we ever reveal its true origin. Apologies to the Åman family are long overdue.